And the second is corruption understood as the abuse of entrusted power to facilitate the illicit export of capital by others, and therefore its prevalence throughout the various activities which represent the illicit outflows. And the second important finding we must mention is that the outflows from Africa end up somewhere else in the world. Accordingly, to stem these outflows requires cooperation and joint action among the originating and the receiving countries. And I'd like to make two observations in this regard. One of these is that the various tax havens and the financial secrecy jurisdictions in Africa and elsewhere in the world are at the center of the problem of illicit financial outflows, since they are among the major and this calls for concerted international action to address this challenge, since it is clear that transparency in terms of financial transactions is indeed key. It's key to achieving success in the fight against the illicit outflows. And our second observation is that as yet there is no global architecture to ensure the required concerted global action to combat the illicit financial outflows. In this regard, even as our panel says that, and I quote, that there are a large number of commendable initiatives and instruments which it lists to deal with the commercial, criminal, and corrupt activities of the international financial, illicit financial flows, which it says are nevertheless disparate and handled in separate processes and forums. It suggests that it would be best that the matter of the illicit financial outflows is dealt with comprehensively under the auspices of the United Nations. Yet another important finding of our panel is that many of the African countries lack the capacity to combat these illicit flows and makes various recommendations in this regard. And I'll come back to that. And another finding we must mention relates to the matter of the unwise use of tax incentives to attract foreign direct investment. And in this regard, the panel stated that, and I quote, in many instances, these policy decisions to grant the tax incentives are not guided by proper cost-benefit analysis, but rather by the intention of outdoing competitors for foreign direct investment, with the intention of outdoing these competitors for foreign direct investment, leading to harmful tax competition and a race to the bottom. And the second last finding we would like to mention concerns the important matter of corruption. And in this regard, the panel said, and I quote again, corruption remains a matter of major concern despite the global and regional attention that resulted in the adoption of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And the panel said that corruption is a cross-cutting and integral part of the illicit financial road. Corruption in the form of abuse of entrusted power for private benefit in both the public and private sectors thus remains an issue of continuing concern, unquote. And the last finding we'd like to mention relates to the need to expedite the processes of asset recovery and repatriation. And in this regard, the panel drew attention to the importance of the United Nations, the UN and the AU Conventions Against Corruption, which we've just mentioned, as well as the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, which is a partnership between the World Bank and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Asset Recovery Interagency Network of Southern Africa. With your permission, Mr. President, I'd like to elaborate a little more on some of the panel findings I've mentioned by quoting some paragraphs from the panel report. And this will relate to the matter of the corporations, the companies, the tax incentives, and the issue of the capacity of our countries to fight against the illicit financial outflows. And the panel report says that the commercial sector is a major source of illicit financial outflows in Africa, but it is the least understood. And this is due to the range of methods by which the illicit financial flows take place in the commercial sector, as well as the technicality of issues such as transfer pricing, tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance, trade misinvoicing, tax incentives, double taxation agreements, and the like. And it said, although the OECD is working to address issues of base erosion and profit sharing, this work is not principally geared to developing country concerns. That African governments are concerned about the negative impact of these illicit financial outflows on their tax revenues and investment capital. But most of them lack legislation and guidelines on transfer pricing or effective units to address the problem. And the report went on to say African countries need to pay closer attention to the illicit flows from the commercial sector. This means developing the required capacities, establishing or strengthening necessary institutions, including transfer pricing units, and providing resources for the effective functioning of these institutions. It would also mean holding multinationals accountable for fraudulent practices by setting up requirements for their transfer of funds and their business practices. And with regard to the matter of tax incentives, and the report says that there is a clear need to undertake cost-benefit analysis in granting tax incentives, especially tax holidays intended to attract foreign direct investment. And moreover, there should be coordination of such incentives among regional economic communities to develop a common standards and prevent a race to the bottom. And it says for tax holidays, rules should be drawn up to prevent the same entity or beneficial owner from continuing to benefit after there is an apparently substantial change in ownership. And concerning the issue of capacity, the report states that the ability of African countries to combat the illicit financial flows is seriously impeded by deficiencies in their capacities to track, to stop and repatriate illicit financial outflows. And this lack of capacity is reflected at various levels, such as the lack of accurate data and up-to-date information, inadequate understanding of the various mechanisms used, and absent or ineffective legislative, regulatory, and institutional frameworks. And it says most African countries do not have enough highly trained lawyers, accountants, and tax experts to carry out the oversight functions to prevent or punish perpetrators of illicit financial outflows. The few that exist are often overworked and unable to prepare sufficiently to take on top-class professionals representing the large corporations. And illicit financial outflows from Africa can be reduced and stemmed only by enhancing and improving relevant capacities across the board. And this requires a dedicated and upscaled effort to provide resources. It means providing money to create relevant agencies, such as the revenue authorities, transfer pricing units, customs services, the anti-corruption agencies, financial intelligence units, and the like, where these do not exist. It also means strengthening the existing institutions by giving them the necessary autonomy and tools with which to carry out their duties. It further means recruiting and training top flight personnel and making efforts to retain them in the public sector. And regional efforts are also needed, including through such forums as the African Tax Administration Forum and related mutual assistance programs. And it says that the support of the global community is also essential to make up the current capacity deficiencies. The idea of tax inspectors without borders is a good example of how such support could be rendered. And Mr. President and honorable members, I've just quoted some paragraphs which relate to only three out of the 15 findings in the panel report. Nevertheless, these paragraphs are sufficient to indicate the extent of the detailed work we as Africans have to do effectively to arrest the illicit capital outflows from our continent. I would therefore urge that you study the report of the panel, the better to empower yourselves correctly to determine what you should do as the elected representatives of our people to help implement the recommendations of the panel. Further, I would also suggest that you study the important African Union Assembly Declaration on illicit financial flows, especially the actions that should be taken to stem these outflows. As an example, Honorable President, the Assembly of the AU resolved to, quote, request the AU Commission, the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, the African Capacity Building Foundation, and other development partners to build capacities of African Union member states and institutions, particularly in contract negotiation, tax management, regulatory and legal frameworks, money laundering, asset recovery and repatriation, and resource governance for effective and optimal management and governance of our natural resources. The Assembly also urged that carrying out of advocacy work to disseminate the panel's findings and to galvanize support from a broad coalition of partners, including civil society and the private sector, to implement the panel's recommendations was necessary. Obviously, Honorable President, the Pan-African Parliament will have to define its own specific role and the practical work it will do to implement these and the other actions to help ensure that we stem and stop the illicit capital outflows which impact so negatively on the continental development efforts. I'd like to conclude by quoting yet another paragraph from the Declaration of the AU Assembly. Our heads of state and government said that they are aware that the problem of illicit financial flows is exacerbated by corrupt tendencies of government agencies, by lack of or weak African institutions both at national and continental levels in all sectors, governance challenges, political instability and conflicts, weak tax administrations, and lack of capacity to monitor and curb such criminal activities, among others. Unquote. I think, Honorable President, this further clarifies the areas on which you and our elected representatives need to focus to retain within our continent the valuable resources that will help us to achieve the better lives for the billion Africans to which all of us are committed. We are therefore confident Honorable President, that the Pan-African Parliament will indeed respond energetically to the call to track it, to stop it, and to get it. I thank you very much for your attention.
Honourable members, please give another round of applause to His Excellency. For that wonderful presentation. Honourable members, I now have a list of members who have indicated their interest to intervene in the debate. I will give each member 3 minutes to make his or her intervention. I shall now allow debate on the presentation. The first speaker on my list is the Honorable Chenamo Chimutengwende from Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank the former President of the Republic of South Africa, Comrade Thabo Mbeki, and to thank the African Union and the eNCA Conference of Ministers, which enabled this task headed by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. What the book that has been given us about the work they did the book is excellent, and we warmly receive it. And we must insist that what is in the book actually confirms what has been the situation before. It exposes how imperialism works. It is unacceptable that in this day and age, over $50 billion a year is being siphoned from Africa illegally, which means without paying taxes. 75% of Africa's exports are in raw materials, and only 14% are in manufactured goods. It is equally disturbing that inter-African trade is only at 10 and up to 12% because of obstacles placed on us by the donor countries or former colonial masters. They ensure that it is cheaper for African states to export to Europe and the Americas rather than among ourselves, because they will ensure that we don't develop value addition and beneficiation of our products. The problem is that in this day and age, up to all African resources are still largely owned or controlled by Western multinational corporations. The foreign companies and investors are involved in massive and continuous profit shifting, trade mispricing, and making falsified invoices with their parent companies and others. They hide their true revenues so as to avoid paying taxes in the countries of their operations. They bribe as many Africans and in senior positions as possible, and this makes them the bribed Africans to cooperate with imperialists and become super rich overnight at the expense of their own people and countries. The oppression and exploitation of Africa by foreigners and some capitalistic members of the ruling elites in our countries also include organized crime, smuggling, outrageous scandals.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the Honorable Fenyo Butali from Botswana.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me start by paying tribute to His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, one of the finest sons of this continent, and we thank him for his continued engagement in this journey of trying to better our continent. Yesterday I spoke very briefly about what I believe is the route, what I believe is the way that we as Africans, we as the current crop of members of the Pan-African Parliament should go. I posited here that charity begins at home. I said that we need, first of all, to look at ourselves in this house and ask ourselves whether, as we preach peace and security, do we campaign, do we encourage democratic reforms in our own countries? I want to say the same today. That as we speak about illicit financial flows, we should know that the very governments that we represent, the very parties that we represent are active players in this thing. We have let our peoples down because when in our countries, when activists talk about access to information laws that will ensure transparency, that will ensure accountability, we shoot them down, because we don't want our citizens to have access to the information, because they will ask relevant questions about how money is used, how resources are being allocated. We do not want such transparency, we do not want such accountability. I wanted also to say that we should know that secrecy is corrosive. Illicit flows is just one of the many ills that are as a result of the way we govern.